All right, well, it seems like we got quiet already, so I guess that assumes it's time to begin. Thank you all for coming this evening. Dan is out tonight, so this evening, Mr. Gary Dodd will once again be giving us our class this evening, which we're very excited for. We'll have our song as we normally do, which is going to be Step by Step. Step by Step will be our song for before Gary comes up. Oh God, you are my God, and I will ever praise you. Oh God, you are my God, and I will ever praise you. I will seek you in the morning, and I will learn to walk in your ways, and step by step you'll lead me, and I will follow you all of my days, and I will follow you all of my days, and I will follow you all of my days, and step by step you'll lead me, and I will follow you all of my days.
Good evening. Glad to have this opportunity to speak to you tonight, and going to do something a little bit different this evening. And I want you, if you have questions, to hold them until after we have had the invitation song. And then I'll be happy to answer any questions that might be on your heart, and happy to do that. And so we'll make sure that we allow time for that tonight. What I want to do tonight is talk about lessons that I learned on a bike ride. On August 1st, 20 years ago, we were hurriedly trying to finish pack an RV, and we were also new media was coming to the house, and some of you are familiar with Terry Bolger. And Terry Bolger from Channel 4 came to the house to do a family kind of feel-good story as we were packing up our RV and getting ready to go to Washington State to ride our bicycles through the lower 48 contiguous states over the next several months. We had found a young couple that had gotten married that summer, and we found them before they were married and told them if they wanted to, after they married, they could live in our house for a year rent-free if they would just manage our correspondence and pay the bill. And so they did that, and that was a great help to us, knowing someone in the house, and someone was managing the house and taking care of it. But what happened to generate this trip was that I was driving home from worship on a Sunday evening, and both of our children were in my car. And I was talking to Andrew and Rebecca. I didn't know that Andrew and Rebecca, we were in the car together, and I was telling them that I couldn't believe that 15 years had gone by. I was into the 9th grade year, and before I knew it, I was blinking my eyes, and they were both going to be in college. And I said, I wish I could think of a way to spend more time with you. And Rebecca, off the top of her head, said, well, let's bike across America. And I laughed because the only thing our bikes did was make it hard to park the cars in the garage. We were not avid bikers at all. But we got home that night, and everybody had gone to bed. And I went to bed, and I woke up in the middle of the night thinking, how in the world would you do this? How would you ride your bike across America? Well, I hadn't told Faith what Rebecca had said in the car, and so the next morning when we sat down to have coffee and an apple, and I told her what she said. And soon the kids were down getting their breakfast before they left to go to school. And I was going to drive them to school because they weren't old enough to have a license yet. And we talked about it at breakfast, and everybody's laughing about it and kidding about it. And Faith said, why would we want to just ride across America from the Atlantic to the Pacific or vice versa? Said, why wouldn't we want to ride through all 48 states? And that made us all laugh. We thought that was really funny. And so the kids got ready for school, and they went upstairs and came back down with their school stuff and got in the car. And after I got them dropped off to school, Faith was already at her job, and I called her, and I said, would you really consider this? And she said, yes, I would. So I wasn't really expecting that answer. But then we got home, and that night we actually got out a paper map of the United States and got out spools of thread and started trying to figure out how would you go through all 48 states on a single bicycle ride. And talked to the children about it, and they said, yeah, we'll do that. You emphasized, that means you're going to not be with your friends for your sophomore year of high school. And they said, yeah, we would do that. And so we met with Lipscomb High School, and they said, well, yes, they could do home study for that year and then come back for their junior and senior year. And so we got to talk to them about what classes we could teach. And they told us we could teach English 2, we could teach geometry, we could teach art, and there was one other class, and I'm just going blank on it tonight. But the funny thing was, we were going to end up riding our bicycles as a family about 9,500 miles, and they would not let them have PE credit. We were going to visit all these national parks and national monuments and battlefields and go across the country doing all these study things and seeing where, the American Revolutionary War began and where the Pilgrims, landed and all of this stuff, and we couldn't teach them history. And we just thought that was really funny, but what it was that they were having us teach classes that were sequential, basically. And before they were going to let them move to the third year of English, or before they let them move to Algebra 2, they were going to have to demonstrate when they got back by taking tests that they were ready to make that move. But we didn't know that all year. We found that out when we got back home the following summer. And then the pressure was up on the kids at that moment, but they ended up passing their test just fine. So from the end of April of 2001 until the 1st of June 2001, in about 6 weeks' time, we had decided that we were going to make this trip. And you might say, well, how were you going to fund the trip? Well, we didn't have anybody that came along and said, oh, let us pay for that. You go do that. No. And so what we did, we let that couple live in our house, and we took a second mortgage on the house to pay for the trip so that we could have that type of time with our children. And that's the way we decided to pay for it, and we gave up our jobs in order to leave and to do this. I think one of the hardest things for me was it was like I was retired from 43 to 44 years of age, and then to come back home and to go inside where there were all these ceiling tiles above me, it's like, whoa, maybe I did this trip too early in my life. But that's what we did. And so from June until the 1st of August, we assembled equipment that we needed. My college roommate's little brother used to own the Alante bicycle shop here in Brentwood. And I went to Kerry and asked him if he could help us out. And he said, yeah. He said, I can help you out. And he said, I can even discount some of the equipment. But I was just asking him if he could help us figure out what we need to ride. And he told us what kind of bikes we need to ride. He measured us, got those ready for us, got us all these replacement parts that he figured we most likely would need, spending that much time on a bike, and helped us put all that together. But the bikes didn't arrive to our home until 2 days before we were leaving. So the way we trained was by going to the local YMCA and doing spin classes. And after about 2 of those classes and sitting on one of those little seats, I thought, what in the world have I done? But we just kept training and kept preparing for that. And so, from the end of April till the 1st of August, we had made a commitment to make that journey. And so, that's the genesis of the trip. Now, what we were going to learn was how beautiful God's creation is. Now, Faith had been to all 48 states before we took this trip, but I hadn't. And I had been to Peach Creek, West Virginia, and she'd never been there, and I'm sure it's on your bucket list. But she'd been to 48 states with her folks, but I had not traveled that way. Our kids had not seen all 48 states, and that was just a dream that she had, that she'd be able to expose them to those, and also to Alaska and Hawaii before they got away from us. And we were going to see, we live in a diverse country, a beautiful country, and then to see all of that and to realize it was God's creation. It was what He had made. And then we were going to be so blessed as we went across the country by God's people. And I guess it was probably somewhere around 2/3 of the states, maybe 36, 37 of the states, where people that didn't know who I was at all said, sure, you can come preach. Sure, you can come teach a Bible class for us. And so in some of those states, it was multiple congregations as we rode from place to place. It wasn't that we just took our bikes and rode a little bit in the state and then drove somewhere else and rode a little bit. I mean, once we'd put a bike on the road, we had a bike on the road constantly. And to our knowledge, we're the only family in America that has ridden a contiguous ride through all 48 states. And by the time we finished, we'd gone about 9,500 miles. Each of us had probably ridden 6,000 to 6,500 miles as part of that. The kids had to do homeschooling. Some days they'd be a little behind, and so they'd stay in the RV that we bought, a used RV, hoping it would be a chase vehicle, really, and we'd run into some bicycle enthusiasts that would want to drive for us some, and we'd all four get to ride together more often than we were able to. But we drove, chased riders, and that's what we did. And sometimes there were 3 on the bike, sometimes there were 2. When the weather was really bad, sometimes there was 1. And so we chased each other like that. When we'd trade riding positions, we'd touch tires to make sure we had that unbroken thread through the country. And we just met so many wonderful people in the Lord's church. I'm going to throw up 3 pictures right now for you. This is Mike and Kim Lucas. And they were at school at Ohio Valley College with Rick Scott and Alan Stevens and me. Mike, we were able to go to Virginia Beach, where he's been preaching the last 21, 22 years for a congregation there, and visit him last September when we were celebrating our 40th wedding anniversary. And we caught him at church one day, and we went in and reminisced a little and had some time in prayer with him. Mike is a phenomenal young man. He's getting ready to retire after 42 years of ministry. And there are a lot of us that were Bible majors at Ohio Valley College. But to my knowledge, for the year or 2 that I was there, Mike is the one that's just done an exceptional job in ministry. And I am so grateful for him, and I'm so thankful for him and what he has done. But he's getting ready to teach for a university while his wife is finishing and getting to her position to when she can take retirement benefits. But they're planning on staying there and serving with the church on a volunteer basis. Wonderful man. This is a picture of a couple from the Marston Mills Church of Christ. It's on Cape Cod, and he had contacted us early in our ride because of some publicity we had, and he said, I want to ride with you some. And I thought, I don't know who this is. We got up there, not only did he want to ride with us some, but he wanted us to stay at his house. And we were invited to speak at the church where he was an elder. And I realized pretty quickly after talking to this gentleman that he was a man. And I mean, his physical prowess at his age was so far beyond where I was. I don't know if it was 15, 20 years his junior. About 6'5", 6'6", he did endurance races. And he was doing a team competition one time, had a horrible bike wreck. And I said, well, did your team have to withdraw? He said, no, I couldn't let my my team do that, he took duct tape and taped up his shoulder and taped up his knee and got back on the bike and kept riding. Ex-Marine, but a fine Christian gentleman and his wife that offered us so much encouragement. And then if you've ever been up on the end of Long Island, someone from here I was talking to recently had been out to Montauk and was talking about that. But you go on out the very tip of Long Island near the Hamptons and all, there's a ferry that runs from the end of Long Island to another little island called Shelter Island. And Cliff Clark, and this is his wife Trish, Cliff's a graduate of Harding University. With the Olympics going on right now, I thought of him when I was thinking about people I could highlight. He came this close. I think maybe it was the 800 meter, being an Olympian, and just barely missed out on the trials of being able to participate in the Olympics. But his family goes back, it may be 6 generations now, operating that ferry from the end of, so maybe 200 years or more of operating that ferry from the end of Long Island to Shelter Island. And we got to stop and visit with them. He's elder in the church at the East Hampton Church of Christ out near Riverhead, Long Island, and just a wonderful couple. But we met person after person after person like this in the Lord's church. But then what we had was bounty of family time. And I'm just going to let the slides rotate on their own now. And you all can look at those while I talk, and that's just fine. But so often we talk about having quality time with our kids. And I see so many parents torn in so many different directions, enrolling their children in so many different activities that, it's hard for them to have quality time because they don't really have quantity time with each other. And the greatest blessing we had on this trip was the quality time. Now you're seeing these slides and states come up in the order in which we rode through America. We didn't go very far to where those big cedar logging trucks were coming down from Washington State toward Oregon. And I would be driving the RV chasing my family, and I'd see those big trucks go by, and I'd see their bikes go like this. And I thought, I'm going to get them killed. So I got them together that night and got in the back of the RV, and I said, look, I said, I'm fearful I've made a mistake bringing you all the way out here and everything. I said, those big trucks going by, I said, I'm going to get you killed. They said, Dad, don't be morbid. We came out here to ride. And so we kept riding. And we rode through the 5 uppermost northwestern states. Now, this is the Madras, Oregon church, and that was their missionary, preacher, and his wife, Lee and Carol Rotman. Lee is a phenomenal man, one of the most evangelistic men I've ever met in my life. But unique to what he does 52 weeks of follow-up study with each person he baptizes. And he believes in what Matthew says, teach, baptize, and teach. And he's put together a curriculum. I don't know how many people they've had in their home, how many different times, in order to meet with them week after week after week after they've been baptized. He wants to ground them in the faith. And he just, and his wife just contacted us recently, 75, and he's having to transition from the church where he was in Nebraska, but he still wants to preach, and he's wanting to know, did I know anywhere that he could preach? And just a wonderful, wonderful family sharing each other. That was a picture of us celebrating our 40th wedding anniversary, and we had a great time doing that on the trip. And you can see we're riding through all these national monuments and all these national parks and going from state to state. And it was just wonderful to get to do that. We were in Billings, Montana, having finished about our first 1,000 miles on our trip. When we got up early in the morning, and Faith and I were going to sneak and have a cup of coffee and let the kids rest, because it was one of the first times we'd spent the night in a hotel since we'd left the house. We were doing that just to celebrate our first 1,000 miles. And she went out to the RV to get some apples to go with our coffee. And I was walking down the hallway, and I ran into a lady in her pajamas and gown, in the middle of the hallway, just sobbing. And I said, "Ma'am, can I help you?" And she said, "Do you know what's happened?" I said, "No, ma'am, I don't." And she said, "Someone just flew a plane into one of the towers in New York City." And Faith had grown up, in New York City and Long Island, so we decided we weren't going to worry about the kids sleeping in. We went back to the room and turned on the TV about the time the second tower was hit by a plane. And we were probably like a lot of you, crying and upset that something like that was happening in our country. And I really lost control when I heard my dad's voice on the phone. And we paused for a minute, but then one of the greatest things that happened after that, a couple days after, and we started writing again, was the number of people that we met, and we heard them express such a deep commitment to this country. We met people that truly were patriots in their past service and patriots in their hearts at that time. And we listened to them and listened to their commitment to keep this country great. And I know a lot of things have happened in the last 20 years, but I am convinced from the bottom of my heart that there are still people in this country that just have that type of good heart. And I believe it's a majority of people. And I'm praying that those people will join you and me in praying that we will be one nation under God. And we will be one nation that honors who He is. And I know there are a lot of challenges to that right now. But I believe that can happen again. And so just in a second, you're going to see a picture pop up. It's the next slide, of a flag. And that flag, the sun was shining through it, and it was just shimmering, half-staff. And that was right after 9/11. And I remember going by that ranch and seeing that flag, and then not too many days afterwards being at Mount Rushmore. And at the end of the program, them calling all the veterans up to help retire the flag, and how moving that was, and the sentiment that there was, the commitment to values in this country and doing what was right and being a united people. And I pray that will come back again. We learned some lessons that were invaluable to us, still are lessons by which we try to live. One of those lessons was to ride through life based on your values and not just your to-do list. There are a couple women in our neighborhood that when I run into them, they'll ask me, say, "Your wife got you working on honey-do lists again?" I say, "Oh yeah, she's killing me." And we joke about it. But a lot of us get up in the morning and we have a list of things to do and we hit the ground running. In full-time ministry, I would get up and I think I need to be at this hospital by this time in the morning. I need to go by this place and visit this person in the middle of the day. I've got a bulletin article I need to write, and I've got to edit the bulletin. I've got to get back and do this. And I would have these lists, and I'd hit the ground, start checking them off. And then I interacted one day with a minister of the Korean church in Memphis. And he showed me this place in his pulpit area. And he said, "This is where I begin every day of my ministry." And what he was showing me was the place where he'd get down on his knees, he'd put his elbows up on this pillow, and he would pray. And I thought, how many times in my life have I just hit the ground running with my to-do list without taking the time to orient myself the way he was orienting himself on a daily basis in his ministry for God? And we have values that hopefully guide our lives. And if we're not careful, we can get at the end of what many would consider to be a productive day, and we've got all these things accomplished and taken off our task list. But how many of those items represented our commitment to our family? How many of them represented our commitment to our God? How many of them represented what we say we truly hold as the most important foundations of our lives? And what we learned by taking this time with our kids was we need to make sure that we have that type of commitment. My favorite basketball coach, in the writings that he's done to read, is John Wooden. John Wooden wasn't a perfect man. I met some of his extended family when I was calling on doctors down in North Georgia. And he wasn't a perfect man, but he taught so many valuable lessons to young people. And he said to work to be as good as you can get. And then he taught his boys, he said, do that, and you can call yourself a success. And he would say, practice doesn't make perfect, but he tried to teach his players that perfect practice makes perfect. And he would teach them on the first day they came out on the court when the new season was starting. They were going to begin practicing. He'd make them all take off their tennis shoes. He would teach them how to put on their socks and then how to lace their sneakers so that they would not get blisters and things like that would hamper what they wanted to do on the court. He was a fundamental guy, and he taught fundamentals to his players, and he wanted them to have values. And when he retired as a coach, it was after 41 years of coaching. He was about to win his 12th national championship. He had just won a semifinal game in the NCAA tournament, beating the University of Louisville. And he knew he was going into a press room where he's going to get asked all kinds of questions. And he said he just had a feeling of revulsion. Because what was most important to him was not going to be the type of questions that were going to be asked of him that evening. And he said he decided as he was walking to that press conference that he was going to retire at the end of that tournament. And that's what he did. And he said the reason he did that was that he would go to speak at a coaching seminar and there'd be someone else speaking, and because of his prowess and the way people regard him, they wouldn't even let him come in and hear the other coaches speak. He was in a room down the hallway, or he was having to sit outside or not show up until the time he was scheduled to speak. And what everybody, when they interviewed him, was wanting to talk about was, is he going to win another national championship? Is he going to do this? Is he going to do that? And he said, all I wanted to do was teach these young men that play for me. Now, how many of us are that clear in our governing values to where we really know what it is that we want to do for God based on His teaching in our lives, with our families, in the church, to where we know what it is that we pray that we can accomplish with God working through our lives. How we run the race of our life is what really matters. And is our planning based upon God's principles? Is our preparation based upon turning to God as we begin our days? Is our practice constantly kept in check by His principles and what He's taught us to do? It's so important that we perform based on what He wants us to accomplish in our lives. Second principle we learned, besides riding through life based on our values, is if you open your eyes, you will get a whole brand, great new perspective on life. My brother's a Hall of Fame University basketball coach, a much better athlete than I ever was. And I would go out to play with his peers and with him, and they were almost 4 years older than I was. And I'd be trying to impress them, and I would throw up some kind of wild-haired shot, and it would go in, and we'd be running back down the court, and I'd get over close to my brother, and I'd say, what do you think of that shot? And he said, well, it'd probably been a lot better if you opened your eyes when you let the ball go. So he was trying to teach me what was important at that age if I wanted to be a good athlete. But what we learned about America was, as we opened our eyes and looked at it in a way that, at least for me, I had never seen it before. I was so blessed by the people I encountered and by what I saw as I went across the country. Rebecca had more flats than any of the other three in the family. And the reason was, she would be riding her bike and her head would be up and she'd be doing this. And I'd say, Beck, I said, I've got to speak at a church tonight. We've got to get on down the road. And she'd just smile at me and she'd say, Dad, I came out here to see the country, And she'd keep riding. And then she'd run over stuff and she'd get flat tires and we'd have to repair the tires. But she achieved her objective on doing that. We saw that the God that we serve has many children of diverse backgrounds. We saw people in churches where they had abundance. We saw people in churches that didn't have a lot of financial abundance. We met people that were extremely blessed. We saw people that weren't abounding in a similar way. We saw people of diverse backgrounds, ethnically, and we got to interact with them and talk to them. We never knew what we were going to encounter when we walked into church. One Sunday I looked around, 45 minutes, I'm thinking, where is Faith? Where is Faith? She was back in a room talking to the minister's wife. Her husband had just been fired, and this lady was just broken. And she needed someone to hear her heart. And there were just so many people like that, and so wonderful. We arrived at a church one Sunday morning for worship. I tried to call the minister the night before and just introduce ourselves and tell him we'd be coming to worship the next morning. His wife said, well, he's out doing this, but he'll call you when he gets home. He didn't call me. He got online and researched me and decided I was liberal. And so when we went into the church the next morning, he wouldn't shake my hand or he wouldn't even speak to me personally. And that was really a challenge. And we'd ridden by another church the day before. And so I whispered to Faith, I said, in the appropriate time, let's just leave. We don't want to make anybody uncomfortable here. And let's go to this other congregation. The other congregation was primarily African American. We walked in, there were pieces of paper on the end of every pew. And what it said were, last names. It might be Pennell, Dixon, and just last names like that on the pews. It was Easter Sunday. And we asked someone what that was, and we got to looking at the order of worship and realized they were having a special emphasis that day that they were calling Pack-a-Pew Sunday. And this family said, we can pack 3 pews. This one said we can pack 2. This one said we can pack 1. And so there were names on all these pews for the people they said they'd bring. And we were sitting in the very back, and where it was primarily an African-American country, we kind of stood out. And this older gentleman walked through a door up to the front, and he stepped out and he looked back, and he saw us back there, and he walked all the way to the back, and he said, why are y'all sitting back here? And he said, well, we've learned that you're having this special day today, Pack-a-Pew Sunday, and we just didn't want to get somewhere where we shouldn't be. And he just smiled at us, and he said, today you're my family. And he took us all the way up to the second row and put us on the row with his family members. Didn't know that he was going to be teaching the class, but he took time to tell the folks when he got to teach the class, he introduced us and told them what we were doing. When the Bible class was over, he came and grabbed me and he said, hey, we need you to help lead worship. And so took me to the back and they said, now you're going to do the opening prayer. And when this young man starts leading singing, who was the minister's son, who'd come in from college, he said, when he starts leading singing, we want you to get up and lead the prayer. Well, I hadn't been in a primarily African-American church for a while, apparently, and a young man started singing that song, and I was sitting there, and this older gentleman was across the pew, or the stage, in another chair, and he was going. And I didn't move. Then he went. And finally, he realized I was supposed to get up. And I mean, when I got up behind the speaker stand, boom, they started humming. And I started praying, and before I knew it, I was in cadence with their humming. And finally finished my prayer. And then, they had their worship, and the preacher preached his heart out. And he had family members that he had filled the pew with his family members. And he was trying so hard to reach them. Now, my son wasn't prepared for this because this man was putting it right on the line. And he said, every young man in this audience, 13 years or older, I want you to stand. And so my son stood. And then he said, I want you to make a commitment right now to virginity and of honoring God's sexual, teachings about sexual behavior. And so there was my son, and he, did what he was asked to do. But when it was all said and done, they brought out all these kids from the Bible classes, and they quoted their memory work for the morning. I mean, the service lasted about 2 hours. And we got in the car, and my daughter looked at me, and she smiled, and she said, I think you kind of like that, Dad, because of the way it was done and the way the prayer and everything took place. But one of the wonderful things about this was every place we went to worship, and I hope you do this with your children, they would come out at times and they'd say, Dad, we've never seen that done before. What do you think about that? And then I could just turn around and I could say, well, what do you think the Bible says about that? And we got to have conversation after conversation about things that were going on in the Lord's church that we didn't necessarily know was going on wherever we went. But it gave us wonderful opportunity to talk about God's will for us and how it's important for us to make sure that we let what He says in the Bible take care of this. Now, this is a ride through, I believe, that's down Louisiana. And some of the churches have been devastated since we were there and are no longer meeting because of the hurricanes and the flooding and that type thing. And we were welcomed in again into diverse congregations. And they let us preach, let me preach. And my son sometimes was preaching and teaching as well. One of the other principles that we carried out of this trip was it's a whole lot harder to pedal uphill, but the view from the top is worth it. I purposefully, Faith made out a list of several pages of single-space paper of where she wanted to take the kids, but it wasn't in order. These are just things she wanted them to see. And so I'd never been a member of AAA, but I joined AAA, and I went there, and they said, what can we do to help you today? And I said, well, we need a triptych done. And I gave them all these places, and they looked at this list, and they said, what in the world are you going to do? And I told them we were going to bike across America. And they were shocked at that. And my brother, when I told him, I called him and told him what we were going to do, and he said, okay, Forrest. And I said, no, I'm serious. This is what we're really going to do. And they put this triptych together, and they gave us about 37 or 38 of their travel guides for every state and picked it up, and we kind of planned it out. And I promise you, I picked the least elevated road in the Rocky Mountains to go across. It was like 9,000 some feet. And I thought that'll be enough challenge for us. And we were in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and I'd spoken for a church there. And then we went out to Burger King, and you know how the tables are at Burger King. So I'm way down here with some church members, and kids are with some people, and my wife's down the far end. And they're saying, surely you're going to go to Estes Park, and surely you're going to go across the Trail Ridge Road. And my wife said, well, that sounds wonderful. And she told them we would. There's a big difference between 9,000 some feet and 14,200 feet. And but that's what we ended up doing. In order to do that, that was one ride that we did together. We just parked the RV in Estes Park. We rode our bikes up that hill top. It started snowing on us as we got to the top, and they were going to close the road. So two of us coasted back to get the RV while the other two kept going down the other side of the mountain. But that was one of the neatest feelings in the world to get to that summit and to see the view and to have done that as a family working together. And Stephen Ambrose tells this story in Undaunted Courage, the book about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And he says they got to the head of what they thought were the head waters of the Columbia River, according to their maps. And they thought there's going to be a pretty easy rest of the trip, to get to the Pacific Ocean, a lot of it in the water. And as they were setting up camp, one of them, Lewis or Clark, went up on this cliff to look out west and just to relish where they had arrived and what they had accomplished to that point and to think about the rest of the journey. And when he looked west, what Ambrose says he saw were the Rocky Mountains. And he realized they had some of the most arduous part of their trip still in front of them. And that's the way life is, isn't it? We have highs, we have lows, we have challenges that we never dreamed we were going to face in our lives. And then we get to the point to where we, hit that challenge and it just smacks us in the face like seeing the Rocky Mountains in front of us. But by depending on God and letting Him work in our lives, and by believing what He says about He'll never forsake us or leave us, by believing what He says when He says He'll be there to fight our battles, when we put our faith in Him, then we can face those challenges. And with His working in our lives, we often can get to the top and then have a brand new perspective on what a wonderful God it is that we serve. The view is worth the effort. And then the final principle I want to mention to you is to be motivated by the journey and not just the destination. Now, I want you to look at a couple of pictures here first. I paused this on purpose. I knew John Kerry was going to be running for president at some point. And we were on the back of the Capitol steps because Senator Frist had one of his people that work for him contact us and says, when you get to Washington, I want you to come and meet with me in my office, and then we're going to get you in to where you can watch the Senate and the government function. And so he set all that up for us. And we're walking up the back steps of the Capitol. And John Kerry comes, bounding down the steps. And I holler at him, and I say, Senator Kerry, and he stops. And he comes over, and I tell him what we're doing. And we're riding across America as a family. And I said, would you mind if I took a picture of my family with you? And I found this so intriguing. And, and I hadn't been in the limelight a lot and that type thing. And so we stopped. We took this picture. He immediately knew that it had captured him with his head down, his mouth open, and it wasn't a great picture. And he said, you know what? He said, I don't think the light is real good the way we're saying. Do you mind if we turn and take another one? I said, well, no, sir. I'm happy to do that. And I hadn't seen the picture. I didn't know how it turned out. But then when I saw the second one, I knew, look at that smile. Look at that head up. He knew exactly, what he wanted to do. And Senator Frist, I had no idea a few years later after this trip that I would be working at a company that he founded, and I would have the opportunity to write opinion editorials, one that was put on an international website because of my getting to write it with him. And that the company he led would be a blessing in our lives. But, it's really neat when a person gets to meet the president of this country. And if you ever have that opportunity, I'm sure some of you have, and if you get to spend time with them, I hope it's better than what happened to me, because this was just a cutout at the mall. And so I think these will start rolling on their own again. But that last principle I wanted to emphasize was be motivated by the journey and not just the destination. Faith's daddy wrote and published his own Bible study that he would do with individuals in the Northeast and other places he would go around the world. And he called it a soul journey. And he would try to lead people into an understanding of what it was like for their soul to be on a journey that was going to end up with God. And what it was going to be like along the way once they gave themselves to God, and what God could do in their lives. Goals are important, but not if they rob you of the joy of living. I've met a lot of people in my life that had wonderful goals, and they were trying to get to a certain level in life. And they would talk about the legacy that they wanted to leave their children. But they were never around their kids because they had all these goals. And yeah, in terms of the world, they had made great success, and had reached great levels in this life. But what you have to ask is, what matters the most? We all need to periodically evaluate our goals. We have a young man serving as a youth intern here. And his great uncle stood behind the Lord's Supper table one Sunday. His work was accounting. And he represented some of the wealthiest people in this area of the state. And he said, but I see so many people that have achieved what the world would say is great success, but they're so unhappy because they don't have the Lord. And then he talked to us about how we approached the Lord's Supper and how we approached living for Him. And we live in a most prosperous time. And we live in a time, if you read the type of literature I'm exposed to, there's an increasing amount of people dealing with anxiety and depression in their lives. And so you have to ask, where are our priorities? And I know there are people of faith that have periods in their life of anxiety and depression, and I'm not saying that's a spiritual problem at all. But what I'm saying is, if we build our lives in such a way to where we create any of that, that's where Satan can rob us of what God wants us to know and enjoy. I think all of us tend to glorify the past at times. All of us are probably hopeful for a great future, an exciting future. But if we focus too much on the past, or if we're always looking so far ahead, there's a real possibility we're going to miss the joy of the day. Jesus said, today is sufficient for the evil thereof. Trust God. Put your faith in Him. Look to Him. Let Him bless you. And let Him provide for you like He does those birds and like He does those fields. And let God give you what you need. And don't take your eyes off Him. Robert Louis Stevenson said, to travel hopefully is better than to arrive. Now, I want to arrive at heaven when Jesus appears a second time and He takes us home. I want that in my life. But what we have to do today is to realize He came to give us abundant life. He came to give us a joy that we can find nowhere else. He came to give us a relationship with Him where we can cast our every care upon Him. He came so that we could know what it is to be served by a God that allows us to serve Him. And we can count those blessings over and over again in our lives. So we want to encourage you tonight to think about that and to think about ways that you can give yourself wholeheartedly to God. We went all across the country hoping, Faith wanted to see a moose, wanted to see a moose. And we got all the way up to Vermont and New Hampshire. We had to cut back in from the eastern seaboard to get in these two states to then go to Maine. And she finally got to see her moose. And then after that first sighting of a moose, she was almost run over by a moose that just came out of the woods and ran right in front of her and Rebecca when they were on the bikes riding together. But there's a painting in the back that I did for my wife on our 20th wedding anniversary of the Portland Headlight. And that's where we finished our journey. And I love the fact that we talk about Concord Road being a beacon of truth, being a light to the lost world, being a light to Christians and trying to help them on their way. And that's what we're called. to be. And so we finished our ride up in Maine, and we had this wonderful family time. We had the blessings that we could count of meeting so many of God's people that we never would have met before. And Sister McKendry, I'm not sure if she's here or not, but we met her and her husband. It was either Minnesota or Wisconsin while we were on that trip, and now she's ended up being a member of this congregation. And so, wonderful, wonderful people. And sometimes you get surprised in ways that you never would know. The next slide is of a young lady that is very special to us. That's Janice Johnston. And Good Morning America began announcing that they were going to pick 5 families they considered America's most amazing families at the end of 2001. And people that we had met on the first part of our trip wrote letters. And one day I received a phone call from Janice Johnston. And she interviewed me. And then when we finished, she said, "May I call and interview your wife and children tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, sure." And they ended up selecting us to be on their program. And she came down here with the film crew, and she took us out to the Natchez Trace and filmed us. And they did a segment on us in February of 2002 on Good Morning America. Right after that aired, got contacted by Mike Gast of Campgrounds of America. And Mike Gast said, "If you'll put our campsites on your website as you travel, you can stay at Campgrounds of America the rest of the way, no charge at all." A little bit later, you saw that old boat a minute ago. It was a historic schooner that at the time was around 113 or 116 years old. Now it's in the middle 130 some years old. Got an email from the lady that was the captain of that schooner. And she said, "I want to take you on a 5-day journey when you finish your bike ride." And I went online and I saw what it cost. And I sent her an email and I said, "You're very gracious to offer to do that, but we can't afford to do that after, self-funding this trip across America." And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." She said, "I didn't communicate very well. I'm not only the captain of the schooner, but I own the schooner. And there are already 2 berths with your names on them." And so she took us on this wonderful ride. And because of Janice Johnston, we just kept getting interviewed by more people. And when we went through New York City, we were in the studio live, and they did another segment on us. And then they actually sent a film crew that was hanging out of the back of a van and photographing us as we were riding those last few miles to the Portland Head Light. And got up the next morning, turned the TV on, and they'd always tell us, anything can happen overnight, and you may get bumped from the program. But Lyle Lovett and Julia Roberts got married. They eloped the night before. And so they told their story instead of telling, about us finishing our ride. But then in 2014, January 1st, they had us back on. They did 2 segments with us sitting there. And that old television program Art Linkletter used to do, and you never knew what kids were going to say. One of the gentlemen that's still a weekend host for that program looked at my son and he said, "What lesson did you learn on this trip?" And Andrew looked at him and said, "We learned a lot, about handling family conflict." And he looked at me and I looked at him. But it was an honest answer. We're a family just like any other family, and when you're living in a 27-foot long RV and you have to crawl over top of someone just to get a soda out of the refrigerator, you have ample opportunity, to have a little family conflict. But that's what happened. And it was a blessing to us, and we're still learning lessons as a result of the trip. We're going to offer the Lord's invitation. If you'd like to respond to it tonight, if you'd like to be baptized, or if you'd like us to pray for you in any way, we'd ask you to come while we stand and sing this song. doors. You can follow a line of folks maybe that'll take you exactly where you need to go in order to be served the Lord's Supper. Thank you for being here tonight, and we'll end in prayer. Father, thank you very much for blessing us on this Lord's Day. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to worship you. And Father, we pray that we honor you in what we do in our daily walk. We pray that you'll please be with us. Please help us to live for you. Please encourage us spiritually. And help us, Father, to bring honor and glory to your name. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you.